The crying girl. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. Even after hearing countless stories from friends and family, I would laugh them off, chalking them up to overactive imaginations or too much caffeine. But everything changed that night in the forest. It started as a peaceful hike. I had taken the day off work to escape the noise of the city and recharge in nature. My destination was Blackwood Forest, a sprawling area known for its dense trees and eerie beauty. Locals whispered about strange happenings there, but I dismissed it as folklore. I loved hiking alone. It gave me time to think and clear my head. The first few hours were uneventful. The crisp air, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush were comforting. I followed a well-marked trail, enjoying the solitude. But as the sun began to set, I decided to take a shortcut I had spotted on my map. It was an older trail, barely visible under years of fallen leaves, but it would save me an hour. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in. The canopy overhead thickened, blocking out the fading sunlight. Shadows stretched long and dark across the forest floor. I glanced at my watch, 6:45 p.m. I quickened my pace, not wanting to be caught in the woods after dark. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched sound. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but it grew louder. It was unmistakable, a child's cry. My heart clenched. What was a child doing out here, alone and at this hour? Hello? I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie stillness. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement. Then it started again, softer this time, as if the child was further away. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the sound. Hey, are you okay? Where are you? I shouted, trying to keep my voice calm. The crying continued, leading me off the trail and into the denser part of the forest. The deeper I went, the stranger everything felt. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed unnaturally twisted, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. My gut told me to turn back, but the thought of a lost child kept me moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, I saw her. She was sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing, her back to me. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed into her hands. She couldn't have been older than 7 or 8, dressed in a white dress that looked out of place in the muddy forest. Her long, dark hair hung in tangled waves down her back. Relief flooded through me. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help," I said, stepping into the clearing. She froze, her sobs cutting off mid-gasp. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, but it wasn't her expression that sent a shiver down my spine. It was her smile. A slow, unnatural grin spread across her face, far too wide for a child. "You found me," she said, her voice soft and lilting like a melody. I took a step back. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed behind me, her finger trembling slightly. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I turned to look. The forest was empty, just endless trees shrouded in shadows. When I turned back to her, she was gone. The log she had been sitting on was empty, as if she had never been there. Panic set in. My heart pounded as I scanned the clearing, calling out for her. "Where are you? Come back. I just want to help." No response. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Even the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves had ceased. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I decided to head back to the trail. The light was fading fast, and I couldn't risk getting lost. But as I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, their twisted branches forming ominous shapes in the growing darkness. My compass spun erratically, refusing to settle. Then I heard it again, the crying. This time it was louder, echoing from every direction. It sounded like multiple children, their voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. My chest tightened as I stumbled through the forest, desperate to find the trail. Suddenly the crying stopped, replaced by faint whispers. They were all around me, too quiet to make out the words, but loud enough to keep me on edge. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and whipped around, but there was nothing there. I started to run, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I tried to navigate the uneven ground. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard. The wind knocked out of me. As I pushed myself up, I noticed something carved into the tree in front of me. It was a symbol, a crude circle with an X through it. The bark around it was charred, as if it had been burned into the tree. Fear surged through me. I didn't know what the symbol meant, but I didn't want to find out. I stumbled to my feet and kept moving, ignoring the pain in my ankle. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the faint glow of moonlight through the trees. I burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. Relief washed over me as I spotted my car parked a few yards away. I didn't look back as I fumbled with my keys and jumped in. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw her standing at the edge of the forest, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight. She was smiling that same unnatural smile, her hand raised in a slow wave. I didn't stop until I was miles away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I finally calmed down, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me in the isolation of the forest. But deep down, I knew the truth. I never went back to Blackwood Forest. But sometimes, late at night, I hear faint crying outside my window. And every time, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to find her. That was the last time I set foot in any forest. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard, but it's haunted me ever since. Some things I've learned are better left undiscovered. The Silent Cabin. There's a cabin deep in the heart of Whispering Pines, a forest so dense and remote that only the bravest hikers dare to tread its paths. The locals say the cabin has been there for decades, but no one knows who built it or why. The stories about it are whispered in hushed tones, warnings passed from generation to generation. They call it the Silent Cabin, a place where no bird sings, no wind howls, and no voice carries. I didn't believe in those stories, at least, not until I decided to see the cabin for myself. I was an amateur photographer with a penchant for the eerie and unexplained. Haunted places, abandoned buildings, urban legends. I sought them out, hoping to capture something extraordinary through my lens. When I heard about the Silent Cabin, I knew it was my next destination. The hike to Whispering Pines took hours. The deeper I ventured, the quieter it became. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, chirping birds, the occasional snap of a twig, faded until there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. It was unsettling, but I pressed on, driven by curiosity. I found the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were dark, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I snapped a few pictures from the outside, the light from my flashlight casting long shadows across the clearing. Something about the cabin felt off. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and stepped inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick sheets from the ceiling. The furniture was sparse: a rickety table, a few chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold ash. A single, narrow staircase led to a second floor. As I explored, I noticed something strange. My footsteps made no sound against the wooden floor. The air was completely still, yet the flame of my flashlight flickered as if disturbed by an invisible breeze. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I set up my camera on the table and began taking photos. The silence was unnerving, but I tried to focus on my work. As I adjusted the settings on my camera, I heard it, a faint knock coming from upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the staircase. The steps creaked under my weight, but the sound was muffled, like it was being swallowed by the air. The second floor was just a single room, empty except for a bed pushed against the far wall. The knocking had stopped, but the silence felt heavier, pressing down on me. I shone my flashlight around the room, but there was nothing out of place. Just as I was about to head back downstairs, I noticed something. The bed was made, its blankets neatly tucked in, but there was an indentation on the pillow, as if someone had been lying there. Then I saw it, a handprint on the window, faint and smudged, as though someone had pressed their palm against the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The handprint was on the inside. Before I could react, the door to the room slammed shut. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on it, shouting for help, but my voice made no sound. It was as if the cabin had swallowed every noise. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to gather and shift. I turned, my flashlight finally steadying, and saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She wore a tattered dress, and her hands hung limply at her sides. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel her gaze on me, piercing and cold. I backed away, pressing myself against the door. The figure took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was a hallucination, that I'd wake up in my bed and laugh about this nightmare. When I opened my eyes, she was inches away from me. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and black. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, I felt it, a wave of despair so overwhelming it brought me to my knees. It was as if every ounce of hope, every happy memory was being drained from me. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was running through the forest, the cabin's dark silhouette fading behind me. The silence followed me, oppressive and unrelenting, until I burst out onto the main trail. The sounds of the forest returned all at once, a cacophony that made me gasp in relief. When I reached my car, I didn't look back. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. I developed the photos the next day, hoping for answers. Most of them were normal. Shots of the forest, the cabin, the interior. But one photo made my blood run cold. It was the picture I had taken of the second floor. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was the woman. Her hollow eyes stared directly at the camera, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. I deleted the photos, sold my camera, never went back to Whispering Pines. But sometimes late at night, I hear faint knocking on my bedroom window. And every time I'm too afraid to look. The Shadow Watcher. It began with a feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck, the instinct that tells you you're being watched. I ignored it at first, dismissing it as paranoia. But as the days passed, it became harder to shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I live in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, surrounded by old brick buildings and dimly lit alleys. It's the kind of place where people keep to themselves, and the nights are eerily quiet. I'd never felt unsafe there until recently. The first time I saw it was 3 weeks ago. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My bedroom window faces an alley, and the streetlight outside casts faint shadows on the wall. At first, I thought it was a cat or a bird, but when I turned my head, I froze. A shadow stood in the alley. Not a person, a shadow. It was tall and humanoid, but there were no details. No face, no clothes, just a dark silhouette against the dim glow of the streetlight. It didn't move, didn't sway. It just stood there, staring up at my window. I'm not proud of my reaction. I bolted upright, yanked the curtains shut, and spent the rest of the night convincing myself it was a trick of the light. The next morning, I peeked out the window. The alley was empty. For a few days, nothing happened. I started to believe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the noises began. It started with soft tapping on my window, like fingernails rapping against the glass. I live on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a person. I told myself it was just the wind or tree branches, even though there aren't any trees near the building. The tapping came every night, always around the same time. Then came the whispers. They were faint, just below the threshold of comprehension, but they filled the room like a fog. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable, insistent, almost pleading. One night, I'd had enough. Armed with a baseball bat and my phone's flashlight, I decided to investigate. The tapping started as usual, followed by the whispers. My heart raced as I approached the window, bat in hand. I yanked the curtains open and shone the flashlight into the alley. The shadow was there, standing in the exact same spot as before. But this time it moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it tilted its head to the side, as if curious. My flashlight did nothing to illuminate it. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness of its form. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it raised an arm and pointed. Not at me, but at something behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the window, the shadow was gone. I barely slept that night. The next day, I called a friend, Emily, and told her everything. She's a skeptic, the kind of person who'd rather believe in faulty wiring than ghosts. But even she couldn't explain what was happening. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," she said. "You should set up a camera. If it's a person, you'll catch them." It was a good idea, so I did. I borrowed a motion-activated camera and set it up to face the alley. That night, I sat in the dark, waiting. The tapping started at midnight, followed by the whispers. My skin crawled, but I stayed put, determined to see this through. The shadow appeared, just as it had before. It stood there, staring up at the window, unmoving. I forced myself to watch, even as fear coiled in my stomach. After a few minutes, it raised its arm and pointed again. This time I didn't look away. It was pointing at the camera. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The shadow knew. It was aware of me, aware of what I was doing. I felt a surge of panic and reached for my phone to call Emily. Before I could dial, the camera's red recording light flickered and died. The shadow vanished. The next morning, I checked the footage. My hands shook as I plugged the camera into my laptop. The video showed the alley, empty and still, until the shadow appeared. It was exactly as I'd seen it, tall and dark, with no distinguishable features. But as it raised its arm to point, the footage distorted. The screen filled with static and the video cut out. Emily came over that afternoon. She tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. "It's probably just a glitch," she said. "Or maybe someone tampered with the camera." Her words did little to comfort me. That night, I didn't open the curtains. I turned off all the lights and sat on my bed, clutching the baseball bat. The tapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. The whispers followed, filling the room with their ghostly cadence. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to block it out. Then I felt it, a presence in the room. The air grew cold, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I opened my eyes and saw the shadow standing at the foot of my bed. It was taller than I'd realized, its form towering over me, its edges blurred like smoke. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The shadow leaned closer, its featureless face inches from mine. For the first time, I heard its voice, low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Leave," it said. The word echoed in my mind, heavy and commanding. As soon as it spoke, the room returned to silence. The shadow was gone. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed a bag and left that night, driving aimlessly until I found a motel. I've been staying here ever since, too afraid to go back. Sometimes I think about the shadow and wonder what it wanted. Was it warning me? Protecting me? Or was it something far more sinister? I may never know. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear the faintest tapping on the window, and I know it's still watching.